You don't belong here. The sentence didn't just land. It echoed, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the low hum of polished conversation and the soft clink of crystal glasses inside the $5,000 a night private dining room perched above downtown Manhattan, where every seat was earned and every mistake was remembered. And in the center of it all stood Naomi Brooks, a black waitress in a crisp uniform, her hands steady on a silver tray while every eye in the room turned just enough to notice, but not enough to intervene, because moments like this were common here, invisible lines drawn by money, power, and assumption. And the man who drew that line tonight was Ethan Caldwell, billionaire CEO, a man whose voice rarely needed to rise to command a room, tall, composed, his tailored suit fitting like authority itself, his gaze already drifting past Naomi as if she were part of the furniture he paid not to notice. But Naomi didn't move, not an inch, her posture straight, her breath even, as if she had heard those words before in 100 different tones, in 100 different rooms, and learned long ago that silence could be stronger than reaction. The chandelier light catching the edge of her cheek as she slowly set the tray down with a soft, deliberate click that somehow sounded louder than his insult. And for a second, just a second, something shifted, not in the room, but in the rhythm, like a skipped beat in a perfectly timed performance. Because Naomi's eyes didn't drop, they lifted. Calm, precise, meeting the space just beside Ethan's shoulder, not seeking permission, not asking for approval, just existing in a place she had already decided she belonged. While behind Ethan, a stack of contracts lay open on the table, numbers, signatures, a deal worth over $500 million resting on lines no one else in the room had questioned. Not the executives, not the investors, not even the legal team seated 2 chairs down. Because when power speaks, people tend to listen, not verify. But Naomi had seen it. A single number slightly off, subtle, almost invisible, the kind of mistake that doesn't look like a mistake until it becomes a disaster. And she had tried to ignore it, because that's what the job required. Serve, smile, stay invisible. But something in that moment, maybe the weight of his words, maybe the quiet truth she carried, refused to stay buried. And just as Ethan reached for his pen, already moving on, already done with her, Naomi spoke, her voice low, steady, cutting through the silence without force. That number is wrong. And the room didn't react at first, because no one expected her to speak. But then the CFO paused, the pen stopped midair, and Ethan's hand froze just enough to notice that for the first time that night, the woman he dismissed had interrupted the only thing in the room that mattered, his control. For a moment, no one moved, not the servers, not the investors, not even the quiet jazz drifting from the corner of the room, as if the entire space had decided to hold its breath and wait to see who would break first. And Ethan Caldwell did not look at her immediately, because men like him did not respond to interruptions, especially not from someone he had already dismissed. But the pause lingered just long enough for doubt to slip into the edges of control, and that was all it took. The chief financial officer leaned forward, fingers sliding across the printed contract, eyes narrowing as he scanned the figures again, slower this time, more carefully. And Naomi did not speak again. She did not repeat herself. She simply stood there, still, composed, as if she had already said everything that mattered, while the room shifted from quiet arrogance to quiet calculation. And then it happened, a subtle change, almost invisible, the kind that only experienced people recognize. The CFO stopped flipping pages and instead went back, one page, then another, his brow tightening, his lips pressing into a thin line. And Ethan noticed, of course he noticed, because power is not just about speaking, it is about reading reactions. And now something in the room was no longer aligned with his expectations. His hand slowly lowered the pen onto the table, not dropped, not rushed, just placed with intention. As his eyes finally turned, not fully toward Naomi, but enough to acknowledge her presence for the first time. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, sharper, controlled in a different way. "Explain," he said, not a request, not yet, more like a test. But Naomi did not rush to answer. She stepped forward once, just enough to reach the edge of the table, her finger hovering above the contract without touching it, respecting the invisible boundary she had been reminded of only moments ago. And then she spoke, clear, precise. The projected revenue adjustment in Section 7 does not match the liability clause in Section 12. It is off by $3.2 million. And if you sign it as it is, you are not just losing margin, you are accepting full exposure. And the words did not sound like guesswork. They landed like facts, clean, structured, undeniable. And this time the CFO looked up, directly at Ethan, no hesitation left in his expression. She is right, he said. And those 3 words carried more weight than anything that had been said all night, because they did not come from challenge, they came from confirmation, and suddenly the balance in the room shifted completely. The investors who had been leaning back now leaned forward. The legal team exchanged quick glances, recalculating risk, recalculating outcomes. And Ethan Caldwell, a man who had built an empire on precision, stood in the center of it all, facing a reality he had not accounted for. That the one person he dismissed as irrelevant had just seen what his entire team had missed, and Naomi did not smile. She did not react. She simply stepped back into stillness, as if the moment was never about proving him wrong, but about refusing to let the truth be ignored. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the table like a line no one dared to cross. And Ethan Caldwell remained still for a fraction longer than anyone expected, his jaw set, his eyes fixed now fully on Naomi Brooks, as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the room. Because power had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably, and that kind of shift could not be ignored. Not by a man who built his empire on control. He leaned back slightly. Not retreating but reassessing, fingers tapping once against the polished wood before going still again, a habit he never allowed anyone to notice until now. "How did you see that?" he asked, and this time it was not a command. It was a question, direct, measured, and for the first time, aimed at her as a person rather than a presence. And Naomi did not rush to answer. She did not step forward again. She simply met the moment with the same calm precision she had carried from the start. "Because no one else was looking for it," she said, her voice even, not sharp, not defensive, just honest, and the words landed heavier than expected, because they did not accuse, they revealed. And around the table, the executives shifted in their seats, some glancing down at their own copies of the contract as if seeing it for the first time, others avoiding eye contact entirely, unwilling to acknowledge how easily something so critical had been overlooked. And the CFO cleared his throat, already marking the page, already calculating the revisions needed to prevent what would have been a catastrophic oversight, while the legal team began whispering in low tones, their earlier confidence replaced with urgency. And in the center of it all stood Naomi, still in her uniform, still beside a tray she had not touched since she set it down. Yet somehow she was no longer part of the background. She was the axis. The room now turned around, and Ethan saw it. He saw the way attention had shifted, the way authority had momentarily slipped from his grasp, not taken, not stolen, but earned by someone he had dismissed in a single sentence. And that realization did something rare. It forced him to pause, not for strategy, not for optics, but for truth. And when he spoke again, his tone had changed, not softer, not weaker, but different, grounded in something he rarely showed, respect edged with curiosity. "What else did we miss?" he asked. And this time there was no hesitation in the room, no hidden laughter, no dismissive glances, because now everyone was waiting for her answer, not because of who she was supposed to be, but because of what she had already proven she was. And Naomi glanced once more at the documents, her eyes scanning quickly, efficiently, not searching for validation, just confirming what she already understood. And then she lifted her gaze, steady as ever, and said, "That depends on whether you are ready to see it." No one spoke after that, not immediately, because her words did not challenge the room. They exposed it, and that was far more unsettling. Ethan Caldwell held her gaze for a moment longer, measuring not just what she said, but how she said it. Calm, controlled, without a trace of hesitation. And that was when he understood this was not luck, not instinct. This was knowledge, earned and sharpened somewhere far beyond the assumptions he had made. He exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, then gestured toward the chair beside the table, a subtle motion but one that shifted everything again. "Show me," he said, and it was not a command this time. It was an invitation, cautious but real. and the room reacted in small ways. A manager froze near the doorway, unsure whether to intervene. An investor leaned back to make space. The CFO turned the contract fully toward her without a word, because now the unspoken hierarchy had cracked just enough to let something new through. And Naomi stepped forward, not quickly, not timidly, but with the same steady pace she had carried from the beginning, as if this moment was not unexpected but simply delayed. She did not sit. She did not take the chair. Instead, she placed one hand lightly on the edge of the table and leaned just enough to see the full spread of documents, her finger tracing a line across the page, not touching the ink, just guiding attention. "Here," she said, her voice low but clear enough to hold the entire room. "The adjustment assumes a fixed cost increase over 12 months, but the liability clause locks you into 18. That gap is where the risk compounds." And as she spoke, the numbers seemed to rearrange themselves in the minds of everyone listening. What had looked solid now felt unstable. What had felt certain now carried weight. And the CFO nodded slowly, already recalculating, already seeing the chain reaction she described, while the legal team leaned closer, flipping to the reference section, their earlier confidence replaced by careful scrutiny, and Ethan watched, not interrupting, not correcting, just observing, because something had shifted inside him as well, not just the deal, but the lens through which he viewed the people around him. And Naomi continued, not rushing, not performing, simply explaining, each sentence precise, each point grounded, until the room no longer questioned whether she was right, but how much more she might see. And when she finally lifted her hand from the table, the silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer dismissive. It was attentive, expectant, and Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now, stripped of the edge it carried earlier. "Who are you?" he asked, and for the first time that night, it was not about position, not about title, but about understanding. And Naomi paused, just for a second, as if deciding how much truth the moment deserved, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, and then she answered, not with explanation, not with history, but with something simpler, something that carried its own weight. Someone who reads what others overlook. And in that answer, the room found itself facing a truth far bigger than a contract, that value does not always sit at the head of the table, and power does not always announce itself before it changes everything. The room did not return to normal after that. It could not, because once something hidden is revealed, it changes the way everything is seen, and Ethan Caldwell understood that better than anyone, which was why he did not look away this time. Not when Naomi stepped back, not when the CFO continued marking corrections, not even when the quiet murmur of recalculations began to ripple through the table like a low current. He stayed focused on her, studying the calm in her posture, the absence of urgency in her movements, the way she did not seek recognition even after shifting the outcome of a $500 million deal. And that was what unsettled him most. Not that she was right, but that she did not need to prove it. He straightened slightly in his chair, fingers interlacing now as if grounding himself in a moment he had not planned for. And when he spoke again, the room listened differently, because his tone had changed in a way few had ever heard. "You saw all of that just by serving this table," he said, not with disbelief, but with something closer to respect edged with curiosity. And Naomi did not rush to answer. She glanced once at the contract, then back at him, her expression steady. "I saw it because I was not distracted by assuming it was already perfect," she replied, and a few heads lowered at that, subtle but telling. Because perfection had been the assumption that allowed the mistake to exist, and now it had a cost, a measurable one, numbers already being recalculated in real time, projections shifting, timelines adjusting, and in the middle of it all, the narrative that had defined the room only minutes ago no longer held, because the hierarchy had been interrupted by truth, and truth does not ask for permission. It simply stands where it is seen, and Ethan leaned back again. But this time it was not to distance himself. It was to take in the full picture, the team, the contract, and Naomi. And for the first time that night, he allowed a small pause that was not about control, but about reconsideration. "What is your background?" he asked, and the question carried weight, not because of the words, but because of who was asking them. And Naomi held his gaze for a moment before answering. Not defensive, not eager, just honest. "Numbers," she said, a single word. but it carried more depth than explanation, because it was not about titles or positions, it was about understanding, and that understanding had just altered the direction of a deal no one else had questioned, and around them, the room continued to adjust, documents being updated, assistants stepping closer, whispers turning into focused discussion, but none of it overshadowed the quiet shift at the center, because the man who had once decided who belonged was now asking to understand someone he had almost dismissed, and Naomi, still standing in the same place she had been when the night began, had not changed her posture, not her tone, not her presence, because she had never needed the room to recognize her in order to know her value, and that was the one thing no one at that table had accounted for. The word lingered in the air longer than expected. Numbers, simple, almost understated, yet it carried a gravity that no title could replicate, and Ethan Caldwell felt it, not as a challenge, but as a quiet disruption to everything he was used to, because in his world, expertise came with credentials, with introductions, with seats at the table, not with someone standing beside it holding a tray. And yet here she was, reshaping a decision that would have cost millions with nothing more than clarity and precision. And that contradiction did not sit easily with him, not because he doubted her, but because he could not immediately place her within the structure he relied on. And that was new. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table now, not in dominance, but in focus. That is not an answer, he said, his voice still controlled, but no longer dismissive. And Naomi did not react defensively. She did not fill the silence to justify herself. She simply held her ground, letting the weight of the moment settle before responding. It is the only one that matters here, she said, and the room felt that, the subtle shift from curiosity to understanding, because she was not offering a resume. She was offering proof, and proof had already been delivered, and around them, the recalculations continued, the CFO now speaking in low, urgent tones with the legal team, adjusting clauses, flagging risks, the sound of pages turning replacing the earlier rhythm of idle conversation, while investors leaned closer, no longer relaxed, their attention sharpened by the realization that the outcome of the night had nearly taken a very different path, and Ethan watched it all, not as a spectator, but as someone recalibrating his own perception in real time, because what had just happened was not just a correction, it was a disruption of expectation, and those were the moments that defined whether someone adapted or resisted. He chose to adapt, slowly, deliberately, his gaze returning to Naomi, not scanning past her, not overlooking her, but meeting her directly. Then stay, he said, the words measured, intentional, carrying more meaning than volume. And the manager near the doorway hesitated, uncertain whether to intervene or step back, but Ethan did not look away, did not repeat himself, because he did not need to. The decision had already been made, and Naomi heard it. Of course she did, but she did not move immediately. She did not rush to accept, because this was not about being invited into the room. It was about whether the room was ready to see her as she was, and after a brief pause, she nodded once, not in gratitude, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, then stepped slightly closer to the table again, her presence now fully integrated into the space that had rejected her minutes before, and in that quiet shift, something irreversible settled over the room, because the line that had once separated who belonged and who did not had just been redrawn, not by authority, not by status, but by truth. And truth does not ask where it belongs, it shows you where you have been wrong. The shift was complete now, not loud, not announced, but undeniable, the kind of shift that changes how people sit, how they speak, how they think, and Naomi Brooks felt it without needing to look around, because she had lived through rooms like this before, just never from this position, where silence no longer erased her but waited for her, and as she stepped closer to the table, the distance that once separated her from the decision-makers disappeared, replaced by something far more rare, attention, real attention, not the kind that glances and forgets, but the kind that listens and adjusts, and Ethan Caldwell watched her with a focus that had nothing to do with curiosity anymore. This was evaluation, recalibration, the process of someone recognizing that a variable he had dismissed might actually be the most critical factor in the equation. "Walk me through the rest," he said, his voice steady, no longer testing, no longer challenging, but aligning with the reality that had already been proven, and Naomi nodded. Once, her eyes moving back to the contract, scanning with quiet efficiency, not searching for errors, but understanding structure, flow, consequence. Your projected expansion assumes a linear adoption curve, she began, her tone even, clear enough to carry across the room without force. But your distribution model does not support that pace beyond the first 2 quarters. You will hit a bottleneck, and when you do, your fixed commitments will outpace your revenue growth. And the words landed. With precision, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just exact. And the CFO immediately began flipping through additional projections, cross-referencing numbers, his earlier urgency now turning into focused correction, while the investors leaned forward, no longer passive observers, but active participants in a reality that was unfolding faster than they had anticipated, and Ethan did not interrupt, not once, because he understood now that listening was no longer optional. It was necessary, and Naomi continued, her explanation building layer by layer, each point connecting to the next with a clarity that made the oversight impossible to ignore, until the entire structure of the deal felt different, not broken, but exposed, like a blueprint that had been rushed and was now being redrawn in real time. And when she finished, she did not look around for approval. She did not wait for validation. She simply stepped back half a pace, giving the room space to process what she had already seen from the beginning. And for a moment, no one spoke, not because they did not have something to say, but because they were all arriving at the same realization at the same time, that the person they had overlooked had just mapped out the future of their decision more clearly than anyone else at the table. And Ethan leaned back slowly, his gaze steady, his expression no longer guarded but thoughtful, and when he finally spoke, it was not to challenge her, not to question her, but to acknowledge something that had become impossible to deny. "You just saved this deal," he said, and the words did not sound like praise, they sounded like fact. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her voice calm, grounded. "No," she replied. "I just made sure you saw it before it failed." Her words did not echo, they settled, heavy and undeniable, and for the first time that night, no one in the room tried to respond immediately, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to challenge, only something to accept, and Ethan Caldwell sat there, still, his fingers no longer tapping, his posture no longer signaling control but reflection, because what had just happened was not a disruption of the deal. It was a disruption of certainty, and that was far more difficult to process. He glanced briefly at the contract, now marked with notes, corrections, adjustments that would have never existed without her, then back at Naomi, and something in his expression shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough that those closest to him felt it. The edge was gone, replaced by something quieter, something earned. Most people in this room have degrees, teams, and years of experience behind them, he said slowly, his voice measured, thoughtful, and none of them caught this. And the statement was not an accusation, it was an observation, one that carried weight because it exposed a truth no one wanted to say out loud. And Naomi did not react to it. She did not look at the others, she did not shift her stance, because she was not there to compare herself. She was there because she saw what needed to be seen, and that had already been proven. The CFO leaned back slightly, exhaling as if releasing tension he did not realize he had been holding, while one of the investors quietly closed his folder, not out of disinterest, but because the conversation had moved beyond what he had prepared for. And in the middle of it all, the room felt different now, not divided, not hierarchical, but uncertain in a way that forced attention. And Ethan leaned forward again, this time with intention, his gaze steady, direct, no longer filtered through assumption. "So tell me something," he said, and there was no challenge in his tone, only curiosity sharpened by respect. "If you were sitting in this chair, what would you do next?" And the question changed everything, because it was no longer about what she had seen, it was about what she would choose. And Naomi paused, just briefly, not because she needed time to think, but because she understood the weight of the moment, the shift it represented, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm clarity as before. "I would not fix the numbers," she said, and a few heads lifted at that, subtle but immediate. "I would fix the assumptions behind them." And the room leaned in without realizing it, because that was not the answer they expected. It was deeper, more structural, more honest. And Naomi continued, her words steady, precise. Because if the foundation is wrong, correcting the outcome only delays the failure. And this time, no one looked away, no one dismissed it, because they all understood what she meant, not just in the contract, but in the way they had approached everything. That night, and Ethan held her gaze, a slow realization settling in, that this moment was no longer about a deal. It was about perspective, and perspective, once changed, does not go back. The room did not relax after her answer. It sharpened, because what Naomi Brooks had just said did not solve the problem. It redefined it. And that was far more uncomfortable, the kind of discomfort that forces people to rethink not just a decision, but the way they make decisions at all. And Ethan Caldwell felt that shift settle in, not as pressure, but as clarity he had not expected to find tonight. He leaned back slowly, his eyes never leaving her, not out of scrutiny now, but out of focus. The kind reserved for something that matters. And around him, the quiet movement of correction continued, pages turning, numbers adjusting. But none of it carried the same weight as the silence between his question and her answer, because that silence had changed the direction of the entire room. And Ethan finally spoke again, his voice lower, more deliberate. Then start there, he said. And it was not a command, not anymore. It was an acknowledgement of authority he had not granted before, and Naomi did not hesitate. She stepped forward once more, not into the spotlight, but into responsibility, her hand hovering above the contract. Again, her eyes scanning not for mistakes now, but for structure. Your growth model assumes uniform adoption across markets, she began, her tone steady. But your data shows regional variance as high as 30%. If you scale evenly, you will overextend in weaker markets and underinvest in stronger ones. And the words moved through the room like a recalibration, subtle but powerful, the kind that changes direction without noise. And the CFO nodded immediately, already marking new projections. While one of the investors leaned in closer, his earlier confidence replaced by focused attention, because this was no longer about fixing errors. It was about building correctly. And Naomi continued, each point connecting seamlessly. You are also pricing based on projected demand, not actual behavior, which means your margin is inflated on paper, but fragile in reality. And that landed harder than the rest, because it did not just highlight a flaw, it exposed a pattern, and patterns are harder to ignore, and Ethan saw it. Not just in the numbers, but in the way his team reacted, the way their posture shifted, the way certainty gave way to recalculation, and for the first time that night, he allowed himself to absorb it fully, not defensively, not strategically, but honestly. And that was rare, because honesty in rooms like this often came with risk. But tonight, the greater risk had already been revealed, and Naomi finished her explanation without emphasis, without pause for effect, simply stepping back again as if the truth did not require performance, only presence. And the room remained quiet, not because it was unsure, but because it was processing something larger than the deal itself. And Ethan leaned forward once more, his hands resting flat against the table now, grounded, present. And when he spoke, there was no distance left in his tone, no hierarchy separating his words from hers. You do not just see the problem, he said slowly. You see the system behind it. And Naomi met his gaze, calm as ever, her answer just as measured. That is where the real problem always is. And in that moment, no one in the room questioned whether she belonged, because the room itself had already changed to make space for her. The realization did not arrive with noise. It settled quietly, like a weight everyone in the room suddenly felt at the same time. And Ethan Caldwell did not move for a moment, not because he lacked an answer, but because for once, he was choosing not to rush into one. His eyes remained on Naomi Brooks, not scanning past her, not measuring her, but recognizing her. And that recognition carried something unfamiliar. Not authority, not dominance, but respect, the kind that is not given easily and never forced. And around them, the room had changed in ways that could not be undone. The CFO was no longer leading the adjustments alone. He was following a direction that had not come from him. The legal team no longer spoke with quiet certainty. They asked sharper questions, more careful ones, and the investors, once relaxed and confident, now leaned forward with a different kind of attention, because they were witnessing something rare, not just a correction of numbers, but a correction of perception. And Ethan finally exhaled, slow and controlled, before speaking, his voice steady, grounded in something more honest than before. "We built this deal to move fast," he said, not looking at anyone else, only at Naomi. "But we built it on assumptions we never questioned." And there was no defensiveness in his tone, no attempt to protect his earlier position, just a clear acknowledgement of what had become obvious. And Naomi did not interrupt. She did not agree or disagree. She simply listened, because she understood that moments like this were not about proving anything further. They were about whether the truth would be accepted. And Ethan continued, his posture shifting slightly, less rigid, more present. "If we slow it down now, we lose leverage," he added. And this time, the statement was not about control. It was about consequence, a real one, measured in time, in positioning, in risk. And the room felt that tension return, not the old tension of hierarchy, but a new one, the balance between correction and opportunity. And Naomi stepped forward just enough to be heard without raising her voice, her tone calm, unwavering. "If you do not slow it down, you lose more than leverage," she said. And the words did not need emphasis, because the room already understood what she meant, the difference between a delayed advantage and a permanent loss. And the CFO nodded again, slower this time, as if confirming not just the numbers, but the direction, while one of the investors shifted in his seat, no longer impatient, but reconsidering timelines he had pushed for earlier. And Ethan absorbed it, all of it, the cost, the risk, the shift, and for the first time that night, he allowed the decision to change in real time, not as a reaction, but as a choice. "Then we adjust," he said, the words firm but not forced. And this time, no one questioned it, no one resisted. Because the authority behind the decision had evolved, it was no longer based on assumption, but on understanding. And Naomi stepped back once more, her role in the moment complete, not because she had finished speaking, but because she had changed what needed to be changed. And as the room moved into action, documents being revised, strategies being reconsidered, something else settled beneath it all, something quieter but far more lasting. The realization that the most important voice in the room had not been the loudest, nor the most powerful, but the one that refused to ignore what everyone else had overlooked. And Ethan Caldwell knew that this was not just a turning point for the deal. It was a turning point for something far more difficult to admit, the way he saw value, and who he allowed himself to see it all. The room moved, but Ethan Caldwell did not immediately, because decisions had already begun unfolding around him. Assistants stepping in, updated figures being drafted, quiet conversations replacing the earlier confidence that had once filled the space. Yet his focus remained fixed on Naomi Brooks, not as a passing moment, not as a temporary correction, but as something far more permanent, a recalibration he could not ignore. And for a man who built his reputation on recognizing value before others did, this realization carried weight, because tonight he had been the last to see it. And that was not a position he was used to. He rose slowly from his chair, the subtle shift drawing attention without needing to demand it. Conversations softened, movements paused just enough to acknowledge the change. And when he stepped forward, it was not toward the contract, not toward his team, but toward her, closing the distance that had once defined their roles. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, because this was not about filling silence. It was about understanding it. And Ethan broke it first, his voice measured, stripped of the edge it once carried. "You should not be standing there," he said. And the words might have sounded similar to what had been said earlier that night, but they did not carry the same meaning, not anymore. And Naomi held his gaze, calm, steady, not reacting to the words, only waiting for the truth behind them. And Ethan continued, his tone firm but grounded in something new. "You should be at this table." And the room felt that, not as a dramatic shift, but as a confirmation of what had already been proven, because authority, when it changes, does not need to raise its voice. It simply redefines the space. And a chair was pulled slightly, not by him, but by someone who understood the moment, an unspoken adjustment to match the new reality. And Naomi glanced at it briefly, then back at Ethan, her expression unchanged, because this was not about where she stood. It was about what had already been seen. "I did not need the chair to do that," she replied. Her voice even, and a few in the room shifted again, not out of discomfort, but recognition, because she was right. She had already done what no one else could, without the title, without the position, without the invitation, and Ethan nodded once, slowly, absorbing not just her words but the meaning behind them. "No," he said, "you did not." And for a moment, the room held that exchange, simple on the surface, but layered with something deeper, something that could not be undone, and Ethan took a step back, not retreating, but allowing the moment to settle where it needed to. "But I do," he added, and this time, the statement was not about her. It was about him, about the way he chose to see, to lead, to recognize value when it stood in front of him. And Naomi watched him for a second longer, as if measuring whether the shift was real or temporary. And then, without hesitation, without ceremony, she moved, not toward approval, not toward validation, but toward the seat that had always been reserved for those who were considered important. And as she sat, the room did not react with surprise, because the surprise had already passed. What remained was acceptance, quiet, complete, and irreversible, because in that moment, the definition of who belonged had not just been challenged, it had been rewritten. The chair did not make a sound when Naomi Brooks sat down, but the room felt it, a quiet shift that carried more weight than any announcement could, because in spaces like this, where power was measured in silence and decisions shaped outcomes far beyond the walls, who sat at the table mattered, and now she did, not as an exception, not as a gesture, but as a necessity that no one could deny. And Ethan Caldwell returned to his seat slowly, his movements deliberate, not rushed, not performative, but aligned with the new reality that had settled into place. He glanced once around the table, not to assert control, but to confirm alignment, and what he saw was not resistance, not confusion, but focus, sharpened and redirected, the kind of focus that only comes after something fundamental has been challenged and accepted. "We rebuild the model," he said, his voice steady, carrying across the room without effort. And this time, no one questioned the pace, no one pushed for speed over accuracy, because the cost of that had already been made clear, and Naomi did not wait to be asked again. She leaned slightly forward, her attention already on the revised documents being placed in front of her, her eyes scanning quickly, efficiently, not as an outsider stepping in, but as someone who understood the structure from within. "Start with segmented projections," she said, her tone calm, precise. "Separate your markets by performance, not geography, and adjust your commitments accordingly." And the CFO nodded immediately, already recalculating, his earlier role now transformed from leading to executing, while the legal team adjusted clauses in real time, aligning risk with reality instead of assumption, and the investors, once impatient, now listened without interruption, because they understood that what was being built now was not just a deal, it was a foundation, and foundations are not rushed. And as Naomi continued, outlining adjustments with clarity and restraint, something else unfolded beneath the surface, something quieter but far more significant, the absence of doubt, because no one in the room questioned her presence anymore, not her role, not her authority, not her right to be there. And Ethan watched it all, not as a man reclaiming control, but as a man recognizing where it truly belonged, his gaze steady, thoughtful, as if recalibrating something deeper than strategy. And when the revised structure began to take shape, when the numbers aligned with logic instead of expectation, when the projections reflected reality instead of optimism, he spoke again, not to direct, but to acknowledge. "This works," he said, simple, direct, and the room absorbed it without hesitation, because they could see it, not because he said it, but because it had been built correctly this time. And Naomi leaned back slightly, not in relief, not in satisfaction, but in completion, her role in this moment fulfilled without needing recognition. And Ethan turned to her once more, his voice lower now, more personal, but still clear. "You changed more than the deal tonight," he said. And Naomi met his gaze, her expression steady, her presence unchanged, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, because some truths do not need to be explained. They simply exist, and in that silence, the room held something new, not tension, not hierarchy, but understanding, the kind that does not fade when the meeting ends, the kind that follows decisions long after they are made. Because what had been rewritten here was not just a contract. It was the definition of who is seen and who is not. And that, once changed, does not return to what it was before. The meeting did not end with applause. It ended with movement, quiet, focused, purposeful, signatures delayed, timelines adjusted, conversations shifting from confidence to clarity. And as the final version of the deal took shape on the table, something else had already been finalized long before the ink could touch the page. Ethan Caldwell sat back, his posture no longer rigid, his expression no longer guarded. Because for the first time that night, control did not come from speaking first. It came from listening fully, and across from him, Naomi Brooks remained composed, her presence unchanged despite everything that had shifted around her, as if the transformation of the room had never been her goal, only the result of something she refused to ignore. And one by one, the investors began to nod, not out of obligation, but agreement, because what they saw now was stronger than what they had come in expecting, not faster, not easier, but real. And in rooms like this, reality always wins in the long run. And Ethan reached for the contract again, but this time, he did not rush. He read, line by line, not because he doubted the numbers, but because he understood the cost of not doing so. And when he finally set the pen down again, it was not hesitation, it was intention. He looked up, not at the team, not at the investors, but at Naomi, and there was no distance left in his voice when he spoke. This deal works because of you, he said, simple, direct, without performance, and the room did not react with surprise. Because they already knew, they had seen it unfold, step by step, moment by moment. And Naomi held his gaze for a brief second before responding, her voice steady, grounded in something deeper than recognition. It works because you chose to see it, she said, and that was the difference, not just what had been revealed, but what had been accepted. And Ethan nodded slowly, not out of agreement alone, but understanding, because power had not left him that night, it had evolved, reshaped by something he had not expected to find in a place he thought he already controlled. And as the meeting began to close, as chairs shifted and documents were gathered, as the quiet rhythm of completion replaced the tension that had once filled the space, Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, watching as Naomi stood, not lingering, not waiting, simply preparing to step back into the role she had carried before the room ever noticed her. And that was when he spoke again, not loudly, not to stop her, but to acknowledge something that could not be undone. You always belonged here, he said, and this time, the words did not define her, they revealed him, and Naomi paused just long enough to hear it, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, and then she nodded once, not in acceptance of his words, but in recognition of the truth behind them, before turning and walking away, not as someone who had been given a place, but as someone who had never needed permission to stand in it. And as the door closed softly behind her, the room remained still for just a moment longer, because what had happened there was not just a deal saved or a mistake corrected. It was something quieter, something deeper, a reminder that the people most often overlooked are sometimes the ones who see the clearest, and that power, no matter how large, means nothing if it cannot recognize truth when it stands right in front of it.